Our goal is not to amass information or to satisfy curiosity, but to become painfully aware, to dare to turn what is happening to the world into our own personal suffering, and thus to discover what each of us can do about it.
We're talking about the environmental crisis, and really we all are aware of it. But at the same time, it's good that the Pope has, in chapter 1, set a tone. He's allowing us to understand the seriousness of what we're talking about. Some people do not regard it as serious, or they don't want to think about it. And so he's calling our attention to do something now. We have to change. We have to do something ourselves. We have to show compassion for the victims of the environmental crisis, and that includes people and the earth itself and all the creatures that are living on the earth and are suffering from human excess and the consumer culture that brings this about. So the first area he talks about is pollution itself. And the Pope is trying to tell us that, well, there's a lot of things, and there's a listing of them: insecticides, and pesticides, fungicides, waste, and then he even goes into the earth, our home, is beginning to look more and more like an immense pile of filth. Now that's strong language. It's far stronger than I thought he would ever said, but he does, because it shows being upset in some ways with what is happening in our world around us. And he's trying to say that the earth is our home, and as being that, well, we have to take better care of it. And so it's for the common good, not for individuals, not for those who are the privileged few who can gain a fortune off of use of water or air and then leave it in a worse condition and not have to pay for it. And that's what makes the profit. We have to understand then that the earth itself has been taken for a loop, has been really what you'd say exploited. And exploited, as we will see tomorrow. In the next section on climate, chapter 2, we will see why some of this has been caused by misinterpretation of our scripture and of our own history. But then we have to say it's for the common good, again, that we are trying to think about this, and we then look and find out that, well, why is it serious? Because the very climate itself is changing because of human causation, and the Pope takes a very strong stand on that. It is because the consensus of the scientific community, they used to say 97%, they now say over 99%. And there's a small number, some of whom are being paid to be, there's doubters, they're to be the merchants of doubt, to try to hold on to what we've got that's hurting our world. And this is really something that has happened on other issues, such as tobacco and tobacco use. And it is happening right now in the fossil fuel economy in which we live. And that this economy is being prolonged by casting doubt on what the problems are in the world. And some of the large companies are to blame for that. So he takes up first that of the air pollution, but then he moves also into water. And water is an area which really affects the poor in a very strong way, because in some parts of the world people do not have enough good drinking water, and therefore they buy bottled water from some corporation that's making a little fortune on what is a right of the human beings to have, the right to good and drinkable water. Multinational corporations have in some places caused this to be a profit-making enterprise. Take what people had a right to have, good drinking water, and selling it to them. What a terrible onset of really injustice being done on our world. And that's part of the environmental crisis. Then we move on to that of looking at the human beings and to that of also all the other creatures of the world, and we find that there is a loss of biodiversity, that varied amount of our world, that goodness that we have in having so many and varied animals and plants, and these being reduced drastically by some type of pollution. And this is happening more often than we think. Many of us know about the elephant which the ivory is so valuable for some, that poaching has occurred to such a degree that some say in 2 decades there will be no elephants. The Pope doesn't exactly talk about that, but he does talk about all the others, and he brings up about the plant life, that great lungs of the world, which is the Amazon and the Congo basin in Africa, that these are being denuded. And they now tell us at a rate of 2,000 acres, or 2,000 square miles a year in the Amazon alone. And this is tragic in the amount of damage being done to that part of the environment which actually produces the oxygen that we breathe. And therefore, it's a matter of internationalizing the battle, if not the property itself. Because we have to make it one that is more than just a local group of people trying to save rainforest. It now becomes a global experience that we all have to face and do. But these are not the only areas, and the Pope goes into the coral reefs, those beautiful stretches of underwater life, you might say, because it is life, and that these are being damaged, and especially with acidification of the oceans, and being eaten away. And this is part of that result from climate change on the world in which we live. And he goes on and has other examples. But as again, the examples are not just for information only, it's for us to be moved to where we'll do something in action. And so he then takes up the decline that has happened in the quality of our world in which we live. And that actually brings a breakdown, both in rural areas and in urban areas. Breakdown in what the civil life, the social life of a community can and is. And he talks about that. Especially he brings up noise, which is a factor. We need a silent space. We need time that we can rest. If we don't get those, then our very human nature rebels, and therefore there is a loss of quality in our life. And he tells also in an instance, because he's done several ventures into the poor areas of the world, how these people there try to compensate for that, a noisy, congested exterior, and then trying to make their homes a more sociable place where people can live and thrive and have their family life. So they try to do and answer this, but we need to support that in every way possible in actually increasing the outside itself, reducing the noise, reducing the congestion that does occur. He goes from there, from decline of quality of life, to talk about the global inequality that's around us. Because who's making that fortune? Well, there are people who can escape the quality, the places where we just mentioned, rural or urban poor areas. They can escape those, and therefore they can allow their pollution to contaminate others, but they will be at a pristine place, but those places are getting smaller and smaller. And there's less place to where you can escape. But at the same time, there's others who try to answer this problem because they don't like problems. They try to say they deny them, and there are a number who deny that there's even any major problem here in an environment. And so they try to answer it in saying, well, it's due to having so many people out there. And so he says this drop in birth rates are listed by some people as being the cause. Sort of a way of answering that it's the poor people who live in those areas that are poor that caused it in the first place, not the ones who escaped and went away and still have tremendous amounts of material that they use and cause and mount up in a consumer culture that he calls a deified market economy. That means one which is sort of, you might say, a god in itself. And therefore those who are actually causing the greatest part of the damage, the consumer, especially those with cars, but he brings up another one, and that is the air conditioner, which is now spreading, and the practice is spreading all over the world. And as it does, it means an enormous consumption of more energy, more fossil fuels that we have to use at this time before the renewable energy economy comes. And therefore, we see a greater growth of energy use in the wrong way, therefore producing the carbon dioxide and other emissions that harm the world around us and cause the greenhouse effect and the growing warmth and extremes that we have, whether rising oceans, or there could be the decline of the glaciers. There's also the fact that people live in those low-lying areas which are flooded. The extremes that we have found in the last few years, we don't know which ones actually are caused by climate change itself because, well, there's always been some extremes, but there seems to be a greater frequency of these, and this is due to human causation. At least most of the scientific community says so. So we have this, what we call global inequality, where some consume as much as they want, and others do not have enough to have. If there were an equality, and we add to that a lot of the materials that we have are wasted, either through luxury use or the food itself. He says in the Encyclical 1/3 of the food, but some people say that in America and Britain, that almost half the food is wasted in some fashion. If that food were redistributed, there would be no hunger in the world. Rather, we have 1 billion people who go to bed tonight hoping and wishing they had a little bit more to eat. So when we begin to see that, we begin to say and agree with him, access to ownership of goods and resources for meeting vital needs is inhibited by a system of commercial relations and ownership which is structurally perverse. That's his words. Rich countries will have to pay part of the debt. And that is really why the climate change conferences, including the one in Paris, it comes up that the developing countries say, hey, we didn't cause this to start in the first place. We were still in a primitive condition. You people that started it should pay more for it and pay some of the debt that is owed at this time to clean things up. And they have a very good and a very just issue. And he stands squarely on the side of those of the poor countries. We have also had, and he brings this up, a poor response to what we have in the destructiveness around us, and that really we've got to strengthen that response. And that's what this encyclical is all about. There's various opinions he brings up. And one is that, well, it can be done by just having better technology. That's the sort of, we'd say, extreme optimist viewpoint on this. But it simply can't be cured in that fashion alone. We have to change our lifestyles, our ways of doing things. And there is no purely technical answer. We have to be involved. It's a moral question that demands moral response. And so there's another way in which you would say, well, there's way too many people out there, so let's just return to a natural state where there wouldn't be human beings. Well, you know as well as I, this won't happen. So that's no answer either. We have to have a reasonable answer where distributing the resources of our world will be done in such a way that's just and able to be done by all the people. Instead is what he says, the present world system is unsustainable. And he ends on this note in chapter 1. It's a pessimistic approach, you might say, but it comes as a beginning of an encyclical that moves on to what we can do about it. So it's setting up the circumstances in which we operate, all the time saying we can do something better. We must do something better. So we will look then towards chapter 2 and the other chapters to find answers to what can be done by us. Thank you.